A brief disclaimer. The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of Georgia Southern University, the Department of History, or other faculty or staff. Good evening, everyone. My name is Julie Deschantal. I'm a professor at the university, at Georgia University. Let's start this again. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Julie Deschantal. I'm a professor at Georgia Southern University, and it's my pleasure today to host this event called Creepy History. Tonight, we're going to have three speakers who will talk about their research and their work at the university. We will start first with Dr. Michael Van Wagenen, who is the Doctor of Public History at Georgia Southern, and he is going to talk to us about UFOs.
Hello, everybody. Let me share my screen with you. I've got a presentation about UFOs and how UFOs relate specifically to history, and a proposed course that I would like to teach at some point in the future on historical UFOs. So, all right, we'll begin here. I like to start with this image. This is a mid-17th century coin from Europe that many UFO enthusiasts like to point to as being evidence of UFO encounters in Europe. And I think it's very instructive of the kinds of evidence and sort of experiences that people will draw from. So I just want to share that coin with you. It is rather uncanny when you look at it. Looks very similar to the kind of UFOs that have been reported in the 20th and 21st centuries above a stand of trees. My interest in historic UFOs began years ago. I was doing some research on a community on the Mississippi River in the 1840s, and in reviewing the newspapers, kept coming across things that sounded suspiciously like modern UFO encounters. This led to further research where I wrote specifically about this community. This was a community of Mormons or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who had created a powerful city-state on the Mississippi River. At the time, it was the largest city in Illinois. And they're very close tie to the folklore, their theology was very much tied to this belief in signs and phenomena in the sky. So that eventually led to a book on folklore, and I wrote a chapter about it, about these historical UFOs. And I want to share with you one account from it. So this is a quote. Suddenly this is from somebody who experienced this. Suddenly there appeared a cloud which hovered over the multitude, having a singular appearance, being accompanied with a terrible noise. The bustle and noise of the multitude was soon hushed, and a profound silence reigned in its stead, whilst every eye looked upon the singular phenomenon with wonder and astonishment. And behold, there appeared a personage in sight that was descending through the ethereal sky and bending his course towards the field that contained the multitude. This personage soon landed in the midst of the multitude. I drew near to him to hear from whence he came, and I soon learned that he was from some distant planet. This sounds an awful lot like in the 20th century, something they would call a close encounter of the third kind, and is very much in keeping with many of the sort of modern abductions or interactions that people have claimed with visitors from outer space. But this actually predates that considerably. This was actually in a Mormon newspaper called the Gospel Reflector, and was an account that did not originate with the Mormons, but actually with other religious groups, and had been circulated around, and captured the spirit, millenarian spirit that many of the people at the time had. So they were experiencing these kinds of events and seeing lights in the skies, moving around and so forth. And in the context of the 19th century, they saw them all as religious signs. In fact, that's one of the things that we find when we look at UFOs in the past, that they're very much tied to religion until we get to the 20th century. Now, I wanted to create a historical framework, an academic framework for UFOs, because UFOs are not exactly something that have a lot of academic credibility. So I turned to the father of modern psychoanalysis, Dr. Carl Jung, a Swiss psychologist. And toward the end of his life in 1959, he wrote a book called Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. So Jung, after a long distinguished career in living through the 1950s and a renewed craze and attention towards UFOs and the flying saucer phenomena, decided that he would write about them. And that became an important part of me to frame these kinds of events historically. Jung talked about UFOs being the appearance of real, it's saying that basically the appearance of real objects affords an opportunity for mythological projections. And what he meant by that, and there's been a lot of controversy about statements he made about UFOs. Many of the UFO enthusiasts claim that Jung was a firm believer that we were being visited by alien life forms. I disagree with that. I think what Jung believed is that people were experiencing valid, real things. They were seeing objects in the skies and so forth. But Jung was not interested in trying to find the origin of them. He was interested in studying what people believed them to be. And he believed that this gave us an opportunity to understand the values and the cultures of the people that experience them. They become basically a mirror of the societies, the people that see them. One of the important events that he specifically studied was and analyzed took place in the German city of Nuremberg on April 14th, 1561. And here, early in the morning, there was suddenly a loud noise. People came running out of their homes and looking into the skies, and saw a number of crosses and globes and fiery orbs and cylinders, and one large object that they described as being looking like a lance head. All of these were flying around in the sky above Nuremberg and seemed to be engaged in warfare with one another. And he talked about some of the orbs seeming to be to lose strength and collapse out of the skies. And you know, in a modern day context, we would see this as something out of Star Wars. But the people in Germany at the time, once again, ascribed this to a belief that these were signs of the Almighty. And here's a quote from Germany at the time, described this event as signs in the heaven, which are sent to us by the Almighty God to bring us to repentance. So they looked at this not as, again, some sort of alien encounter, but rather signs that of God's displeasure with people. In fact, religion very much shapes and frames so much of the early symbols of these things, these events. The Bible itself is filled with all sorts of strange objects seen in the sky. Jacob's ladder, Elijah's chariot of fire, Ezekiel's wheel, and the bizarre flying objects of the book of Revelations are just some of the many strange phenomena that are seen in the sky. So of course, people of Christian cultures would ascribe deeper meaning to them related to their religious beliefs. In the 20th century, this starts to change, however. We see actually a significant change. The modern UFO craze begins in the 1940s at the end of World War II, during a time of great anxiety, both of unleashing the power of the atom through the atom bomb and nuclear weapons, but also Red Scare. And we see that as this anxiety in society grows, there is a greater and greater interest, and people see and begin to interpret the things in the skies as being now invaders from a red planet. And in a sense, the UFOs become a stand-in for communism and the Soviet Union and communist China. And so it becomes a very sort of interesting analog between the two. And so that's another part of what I find interesting, is how this changes in the 20th century and how it continues to change in the 21st century. So what do I want to do with this? I'd like to create a course, just a general course for people who have an interest in this. The point won't be to prove these things as being real or fake, or to ascribe any meaning beyond using Jung's theories of seeing this as a reflection of society and its values and its anxieties and so forth. And I think that that's going to be actually very interesting. We'll understand religion in America, Cold War anxiety, the modern era with technology and so forth, and how this all plays into our interpretations of things seen in the skies. And ultimately, to return to this coin, these hopefully we look at things that are maybe interpreted one way, but if we turn them sideways, we might see something entirely different. In this case, that coin that's often used as evidence of UFOs is actually a shield protecting somebody from spears and arrows. So oftentimes it's all about how we turn something around to look at it. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Van Wagenen. This was really interesting. Our next panelist is Dr. Alena Pirok. She is a public historian in our department. She is a specialist of 20th century US, and she is going to talk about ghosts today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Alena Pirok, and I'm going to talk to you about my course and a little bit of what I do with ghost stories. The course is called Haunted Histories. The basic idea that I work with when doing haunted histories is that a good ghost story engages with the past. So when I talk about ghost stories, what I'm looking at are ghost stories as a way that people explain the presence of the past in their everyday lives and within their communities. Ghost stories as interpretations of past events that resonate in the contemporary world. And ghost stories as powerful tools for telling large and sometimes difficult historical truths. Tonight, I'm going to focus on that last point and tell you a little bit about the ghost from my hometown, Chicago, Candyman. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Candyman. This ghost story actually comes from a 1992 film of the same name. It was set in the public housing project of Cabrini Green in Chicago, Illinois, and morphed into real lore. The ghost story holds that if you say his name 5 times in the mirror, he will come out of the mirror with his hook hand and he'll get you. Now, as a historian, I'm less interested in the gruesome part of the story and more interested in who Candyman was and how this story functions. So let's look at sort of the origin of Candyman. Now, according to the 1992 film, before Candyman was Candyman, he was Daniel Robitaille, a wealthy Black resident of post-Civil War Chicago. He was the son of a formerly enslaved man who became wealthy after inventing a shoemaking machine. Robitaille's father raised him in elite circles, sending him to the finest schools available, and encouraged him to follow his passion into art. As an adult, he settled in Chicago and soon found himself in love with a white woman named Caroline Sullivan. Before Caroline could give birth to their child, her father found out about their interracial relationship and had Robitaille lynched. The mob cut off Robitaille's hand and covered him in honey so as to entice bees to eat him to death and to sting him to death. As a ghost, he took on the name Candyman and replaced his missing hand with a hook. Now, while this story was invented by the film's writer, Bernard Rose, it tells larger truths about racial injustice and violence in US history, and the tragic results that many real-life interracial couples faced. What's more, Candyman's main objective as a ghost is to ensure that people don't forget him or stop believing in him, which can be easily seen as an allegory for the purposeful forgetting of racist mob violence within the United States. And of course, there's more. Like I said, Candyman's a relatively new story. It's relatively new, sort of the ghost story lexicon. And this means that it's quite easy to trace its creative roots. Author Rose attributes the story of Candyman to 3 different elements. The first is the short story called The Forbidden by Clive Barker that was originally published in The Books of Blood. In this story, it also features a Candyman, and it takes place in abandoned apartments in Liverpool, England, which was an economically poor area. There's no origin story offered for English Candyman, but the story highlights the area's decline and gentrification, and the difference between the lives of those with and the lives of those without. The second element is the urban legend of Bloody Mary. This very similarly to Candyman, but if you say Bloody Mary's name 3 times, she comes out of the mirror and gets you. The third element is the real-life murder of Ruthie Mae McCoy. Now, in 1987, a man in the Cabrini Green public housing complex removed the bathroom medicine cabinet in one apartment and revealed the backside of another medicine cabinet in the adjoining apartment. He pushed through the second cabinet and entered elderly Ruthie Mae McCoy's home and proceeded to rob her. Of course, all of this made a lot of noise, and McCoy called for the police. When they answered, she explained to them that a man was coming into her apartment through the mirror, but they did not believe her, and they didn't send help. And after robbing McCoy, the assailant murdered her and climbed back in through the mirror, replacing the mirror that he had removed. When her body was discovered days later, and without any signs of a break-in from the front door, many wondered how she had mysteriously died and where her possessions had gone. And this proved fertile ground for a birth of urban legends. After the investigation, the mirror passage was discovered, as was McCoy's phone call, leading many to attribute her death to the Chicago Police Department's racially motivated dereliction of duty as much as to the actual murderer. And this story resonates and continues to resonate today. Just this past year, the story of McCoy's death reemerged in popular conversation, as in March 4th, 2021, TikToker Samantha Harstow found that behind her New York City apartment bathroom, there was another room that she discovered and then live streamed throughout TikTok. And this brought the story of McCoy's murder back into popular conversation, as well as the story of Candyman. Not a year later, about 6 months, in August 2001, Jordan Peele, who brought us contemporary horror hits Get Out and Us, released a new installment of the Candyman story. This new film deals with the historical and contemporary racial violence and the recent gentrification of Chicago's Cabrini Green. The star of the film, Yahi Abdul-Manti, explained how the new movie and the genre have proved excellent conduits for telling hard histories of racially motivated violence. He said, "What the horror genre allows us to do is tell those histories and narratives as horror stories. And that allows an audience to come with their guards down and ready to listen and digest our stories." He added, "It's sneaky, crafty, witty, a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's like, okay, if you're not going to listen to it this way, try it this way." And it's this way that ghost stories not only reflect what is remembered of the past, but can be used as reminders for hard truths. So if you're interested in learning more about Candyman or the Headless Horseman or any other manner of ghosts within American history, I invite you to sign up for my fall 2022 class of Haunted Histories. This class will trace the United States history from European contact to the contemporary day by looking at the ghosts, ghouls, and creatures and crimes that haunt North America. As a student, you will learn to read ghost stories to learn how US history has been remembered, shaped, and forgotten, and will become familiar with the diversity, complexity, and history of the ghost story tradition within the United States. And at the very least, knowing the history behind ghost stories or knowing how to look at ghost stories with a historical lens will let you watch more scary movies and be able to sleep at night, knowing that they're talking more about the past than things that'll actually happen in front of your bathroom mirror. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pirok. Our last panelist is going to be Dr. Carol Herringer. She is the chair of our department. She's a specialist of 19th century England, especially religion, Catholic religion in England. Just before we let Dr. Herringer start a presentation, don't be shy to ask questions in the chat. I will read them to our panelists once we're done with Dr. Herringer's bit. So Dr. Herringer, you have the mic now.
Thank you. And these presentations explain why I love teaching at Georgia Southern, because people have such great ideas. Let me share. All right. So what I'm interested in is what vampire stories tell us about the cultures that create them. And so my course will actually be in the spring semester. It's also History 2500, called Vampires in History and Culture. So I first got interested in vampires in graduate school. My first semester of graduate school, I was in a Victorian prose seminar, and the last thing we read was Dracula. And initially I was terrified by the novel. I am not a natural vampire movie watcher. I had nightmares about a tall, thin man in black standing at the foot of my bed. But I quickly discovered two things. One, vampires are really good for camp and having fun. So the night we discussed this in my seminar, all the grad students got together and we put on red lipstick and brought red wine, which fortunately our professor liked because we were grad students and it was an evening seminar. And also it's really easy to go as a vampire for Halloween. So with Halloween coming up, if you're stuck for a costume, remember that. And also that it's a great way to think about culture. The vampire is a great cultural symbol. So I turned that first class into my MA thesis, where I looked at different texts from the 19th century, popular texts and texts that were popular in England and in the US. Two prescriptive works of Queen's Gardens and the Women of England that told women how to behave. William Acton's The Functions and Disorders of the Reproductive Organs, which was mostly concerned with male sexuality and channeling that, but has a famous line where he says, the majority of women, happily for them, and in some editions he says happily for society, are untroubled by sexual feeling of any kind. And then finally George Eliot's novel The Mill and the Floss. And all of these works, whether they're by men or women, are greatly troubled by the fact that women who seem to be good and kind and fulfill the Victorian feminine ideal that they are naturally maternal and non-sexual and morally superior to men, that those women are actually untrustworthy. Give them a chance and they will open their home to any man, neglect their children, have an affair in The Mill and the Floss, or at least an affair of the heart with their cousin's fiance. So I was really intrigued by this concern that women are actually not as good as they seem to be. So for my PhD thesis and a lot of my writing since, I, as Dr. Deschantel said, turned to more traditional Victorian religion and culture themes, but I continued to be interested in Dracula. And it got me to a couple interesting places. One was Transylvania in Romania. And there I went to sites that were associated with the historic Vlad the Impaler, who was a horrible man. And you can see on the left, this is a famous woodcut And this is one way he killed his victims. He actually impaled them on stakes. And so they died very slowly and miserably. He also one time invited rivals to a great feast. And when they had all arrived, he had the doors barred and the hall set on fire. So he was a horrible man, but he is the basis for the Dracula stories. I also went to some of the sites there, Sibiu, which is his birthplace, the Sunset Tower, which was the remains of one of his castles, and this Bran Castle, which is actually 20th century. It's a hotel. But it had, of course, you know, a crypt, a quote unquote crypt, and Dracula popped out of that. Romania was a beautiful country. I was really glad I visited, and historically it was very interesting, and the food was delicious. So I've also been to Whitby, England, and you can't really see it because of this headset, but I bought a pair of Whitby jet earrings there. Whitby was famous in the 19th century for the jet mourning jewelry. So I always wear my Whitby jet when I'm talking about Dracula. And so I got to see some of the sites from the novel. This crescent is where Lucy Westenra's mother rented a place. That's where Mina came to stay with Lucy. And this is, in the upper left, is a scene from overlooking Whitby Harbor where Dracula arrives. And I went there for a conference, and so we all walked down the steps that you can see across the quay, and then up in the far side to the church, St. Mary's Church, where Lucy and Mina spend a lot of time, and behind it is a ruined abbey. So it's a fascinating place. So what I'm interested in, again, is what vampires tell us about the cultures that created them. And so I just want to give you a brief overview of the class. One of the books we're going to read is Paul Barber's Vampires, Burial, and Death. And I love this book because it tells a lot of the early modern legends from Eastern Europe about people who are believed to become vampires. And he also spent a lot of time with the LA County coroner and talked about what dead bodies do. So they do all the things that vampires do. Dead bodies, of course, become bloated, and so it looks like maybe the person is feeding on other people. And then if you stake a bloated gaseous body, it will emit what sounds like a scream. So it sounds like if you stake the vampire, he or she screams. In death, the gums will recede and the skin from the fingernails recede. So it looks like the teeth are growing and the fingernails are growing. So it's a really great book written in a very readable style. We're also going to read some early vampire stories looking at the literary genre in the 19th century. John William Polidori's The Vampire is the first literary vampire story. He was on the famous trip with Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron and Mary Godwin Shelley. And that's where Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. It was a famous trip. Polidori went as Lord Byron's physician, and apparently the others didn't like him very much. He was also the uncle of the Rossettis, Christina Rossetti and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and unhappily he committed suicide. We're also going to look at Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which is an Irish lesbian vampire. And as you can see from this cover, Carmilla is apparently a lost young woman who needs a friend. And in fact, she preys on lonely young women in the Austrian countryside. We're also going to look at vampires as political figures. This is John Tenniel depicting Ireland as a vampire, and specifically the Irish Land League as preying on poor innocent Ireland. So if you know Tenniel from the Alice in Wonderland illustrations that he did, this is another side of Tenniel. He was very anti-Catholic and anti-Irish. And of course, we're going to read Dracula because it's a wonderful novel. It expresses fears of all kinds of things, sexual women, effeminate men, foreigners, Jews, different types of women, the new woman, old people not making way for young people. It's a great novel, so we're going to spend some time with that, and then also look at some of the different film versions, because different film versions tell us a lot about their culture too. So the Bela Lugosi Dracula on the left, there's just a lot of staring. It's this sort of romantic with a capital R film, whereas the more recent Dracula makes the sex explicit. And I think one of the scary things about the novel Dracula and the Bela Lugosi version is that the sex is always repressed, which for them makes it scarier. Also, Blackula, which was a blaxploitation film about a man who's actually, according to the film, made a vampire by Dracula. And then some campy ones like Dark Shadows, which is a wonderfully funny TV show. More recent adaptations like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which uses vampires to speak about female empowerment. Some Anne Rice novels, we won't read these, but we'll talk about them and read excerpts. Anne Rice novels are so typical of their time and place, the 1980s and 90s in America, when greedy capitalism was way more acceptable. And I see her vampires as really condoning that. And we are at the end going to look at more recent versions of vampires, and those would be independent projects. Everybody will get to choose a contemporary vampire representation and write about what they've learned in the class and how we would apply it to analyze existing vampire interpretations. So just to sum it up, I am fascinated by vampires because they tell us what people think about sex, death, God, the devil, good and evil, old versus young, eternity in the afterlife, and a whole lot more. So if you are interested in any of that, please sign up for the class, which will be in the spring semester, Monday, Wednesdays, from 2:30 to 3:45 in Statesboro, and it's for all majors except for history majors.
Thank you, Dr. Herringer. I really feel seen today because all of those things I've watched, I'm really happy. So all of our panelists are going to come up and we're going to open this session for questions. We already have a couple of them. I'm really excited about them. So I will read some to you. Don't be shy to add them. I will see them and I will ask them to our panelists when we get to that. So we have a couple of questions, really pointed questions from Michael Van Wagenen, just a couple ones you can answer really quickly, and then we're going to go for larger ones that all of our panelists will be able to answer. So one question is, what historical or modern UFO sighting do you think makes the best case for the actual existence of UFOs?
Well, that's a good question. I actually didn't believe that UFOs were, I didn't believe the alien interpretation, basically. And I spoke at MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, years ago, and I said that publicly, and I thought they were going to beat me. They rushed the stage when I said that. But I've started thinking differently when the federal government about 18 months ago started releasing military footage over California, where fighter jets have been following various unidentified craft flying over the Pacific Ocean. And I think those are really compelling. And those have actually made me stop and reconsider my position.
And another question, do you have any recommendations of books that someone could read to kind of get a historical overview or something?
I like Carl Jung's book because it's really academic, but it doesn't have the fun sort of ET stuff in it at all. But it really helps you understand why people have been seeing the exact same things over time, but interpreted entirely differently. And that's my main interest. So Carl Jung's Flying Saucer book, 1959, still in print. It's very good.
Excellent. Okay, we have a question here from Elise who asks, where do you start your research process for these topics? So I want all of you to answer this. How do you get to that? Where do you start your research into this?
I'll start.
Go for it.
So when looking at ghost stories, the place that I start with is ghost story books. These like thin ghost story books that you find in any bookstore or at the airport. They're usually location bound. So it's usually ghosts of this and that place, ghosts of that and that place. And I find that to be a good beginning because many of the stories that are published in these small, usually like history press books, are also found in federal archives. So many of the ghost stories in my dissertation research, I focused on Virginia, and most of the ghost stories that came in these small books, or sometimes they're quite hefty, have roots in 1930s and 1940s WPA and Federal Writers Project's research. So the stories themselves were collected orally in the 30s and 40s and are published in these books, but they're also in the National Archives, they're in state archives, and it's sort of, in reading these books, you get kind of a flavor for what's out there, and then you're able to kind of dig in and try to find the collections of stories from those books. And in some cases, the people writing the books will say, I went to this archive, and then I went over here, and then I went over there. And you can kind of draw out a map of where you can go as a historical researcher to look at these records with perhaps a different eye than someone writing stories when you want to analyze them.
And I'll jump in. Mine is a little different because everything I work on is published, so I've taught 3 versions of this class, and there's just a lot out there in terms of vampire stories. Penguin has a collection. There's so many different versions of Dracula, and now there's so many different movies and TV shows. And so when people know I'm teaching this class, they will just say, have you seen this? And I say, no, I haven't. The research part of this is I have this article that I keep dropping and coming back to about how Dracula actually shows the acceptance of Roman Catholicism in Victorian Britain at the end of the 19th century. So that's all sort of traditional research, but I'm taking what I know, what I've learned elsewhere from my other writing to analyze Dracula. That's how I was at that conference at Whitby, and that is a tough article to write because there's so much analysis of Dracula already. And of course, if you're writing about Roman Catholicism, you have to talk about Ireland because Bram Stoker was born in Ireland and spent the first 30 years of his life there. So, but there are also newspaper articles about discoveries of skeletons that looked like people thought they were vampires. So once you start looking for something, it's every place.
Mm-hmm. For me, a lot of the modern UFO stuff is in books and so forth, but I tend to go back in time. So I rely very heavily on old newspapers and broadsides, and a lot of that stuff has not been dug up yet. So it's, the way I originally found it was just complete happenstance. I mean, there was a UFO sighting in a newspaper from the 1830s, and I thought, wow, that's weird. So I just printed it, put it in a file, and pretty soon my UFO file got big enough that I thought, well, I better do something with it. And I'm still considering, beyond just the chapter I wrote for the book, still expanding that and taking it up to modern times. And but yeah, again, with digital newspapers that are word searchable, I know a lot of the words that were used to describe UFOs, singular phenomena, singular clouds, things like that get used over and over. So those are word searches I do in order to find that information.
So there's another question, and I want to kind of expand it. So Melissa Gayen asked if the UFO craze coincided with the Second Great Awakening in the US. And I wanted to kind of push it a little bit further and ask all of our panelists, do you feel that, the topics that you're discussing kind of happen at critical junction moments or crises moments where that's the only place where we can kind of talk about something or talk about it. I don't know. I kind of felt that from all of your presentations. I don't know if I'm on the right track there.
I think with UFOs, there's 3 or 4 of these sort of crisis points. And yes, Second Great Awakening, definitely. It seems to launch it. And it's the millenarian movements that come out of it, the Campbellites, the Latter-day Saints, the Adventists, these kinds of groups. It's part of it. It appears again in 1898 at the point where we're moving into empire and expansion. It pops up again in the at the end of World War II, the 1940s and the nuclear era. And then when I say maybe 4, I have to look very closely at what's going on now, but I do believe that we are in the middle of yet a 4th wave of this.
With Roswell and those teleseries and
Well,
stuff like that.
that would I put in the 40s, but this contemporary interest and even this kind of military footage that's coming out and the interpretations of that. I think that we're at another time of anxiety in our society, and so we're looking again at outer space, and maybe it's environmental disaster. We're looking for someone to save us at this point, I think. And so UFOs may provide that, because science fiction has taught us that these kinds of technologies will ultimately save mankind. And I think we've bought into that, whether it's right or wrong. So I think we're in a 4th wave right now. And again, yes, I agree, totally crises. And
I think mine is a little different because how vampires are represented shifts according to what's happening in the culture. So classical times, Middle Ages, early modern, people actually believe in vampires. The Enlightenment comes and scientists and philosophers say, no, this doesn't happen. And so that's why in the 19th century, there's a shift to the literary vampire. And we see the vampires that express fears of, female sexuality, whether it's Carmilla the lesbian or the good women in Dracula who are in danger of becoming vampires. And then 20th century, we have more metaphorical vampires. So I think vampires, because they're so changeable, are very adaptable to whatever concerns society has.
Ghosts are very similar to vampires with that trajectory of there being a true belief before the Reformation, really, and then it becoming more of a literary tradition. But the whole time that ghosts were sort of part of the literary tradition, there's also a subset of folks who are true believers. And when thinking of sort of special moments or epochs, the one that sort of comes to my mind explains contemporary ghost hunting culture, which I believe began to sort of kick off in the late 70s, early 80s-ish. At the same time that we see sort of the new age spiritualism becoming popular, you're also seeing more people embracing ideas of sort of being able to contact the other side. Like there's handfuls and handfuls of daytime sitcoms that would sort of bring people in the 90s and late 80s, where they would talk to someone's dead spouse or dead loved one, and sort of the embrace of sort of this ghost and spiritual realm that way moved a little bit farther away from ghost stories and more into true believer. But in the early 2000s, late 90s, the ghost hunting craze sort of drew those two together. So they were both using these paranormal theories and ideas and sort of tying them with the ghost story and saying the paranormal theory proves the story correct. So there is some sort of shoot-outs, but it is rather consistent. It just it pops up in a new form every now and then.
I wonder, for all of us, or not for all of us, but for all of our topics, it has something to do with the increasing secularization of American society and Western society. So in earlier cultures, people would look to God for answers, but now, as Dr. Van Wagenen was saying, well, maybe we're looking for the aliens to come in, or if we don't believe in an afterlife, and by we, I mean just culture broadly, then we look to ghosts, or then we think, well, a vampire is my way to have an afterlife.
It's very much like a religious a la carte. You're grabbing everything you can in the store and seeing what sticks and what works.
I wonder how much of the stories are also about, mastery. Those who like Guillermo, who ends up being, Van Helsing's descendant and who sort of inadvertently kills vampires. Ghost chasers, in other series, or even like chasing UFOs, if it's that kind of mastery as well, that we're kind of looking into those. Like Buffy was something, you know, I remember Buffy and how much we loved her because she was empowering, and, you know, so I wonder how much of it is that kind of fight as well.
I see a lot of sort of traditional or expressions of traditional masculinity in contemporary ghost hunting. It's a lot of sort of proving your mettle, being scared, but being brave at the same time, that I think is sort of very much the opposite of, if we look at the early spiritualist movement within the Western world, where it was a woman-led movement. This is like turn of the 20th century, a woman-led movement that talked a lot about emotions and feeling, and about how women were more sensitive to the other side because of their feminine emotions. And now 100 years plus later, we have ghost hunting, which is very masculine. It's very scientific, and it's very like yelling back at the ghost. So I think that you're on, like, right on the money with this idea of mastery, definitely.
So
I guess for UFOs, I wouldn't necessarily. There is that element of control, maybe more than mastery, that these various periods of UFO enthusiasm in the country are about trying to gain control over something, whether it's the second coming of Jesus Christ in the 1840s, which many people believed was right around the corner, or control over an expanding universe for the United States, an expanding world of empire, or, you know, the technologies and so forth. So, but yeah, I think that does fit in. This idea of control and mastery are hand in hand.
And I wonder if too, for all of us, because I'm always trying to link things together, all of our topics focus on beings that are intelligent. So my joke question is always, you know, vampires versus zombies, which is better? But I find zombies so uninteresting because they're not very smart. But ghosts, UFOs, vampires, they are intelligent. You know, so I wonder if that's part of their appeal too, that if you do master this, you know, if you scare away the ghosts or deal with the guys or whatever creatures on the UFO, or kill a vampire or become a vampire, then you've done something noteworthy. Whereas if you kill a zombie, it's pretty easy, you know.
that's very true. So ask a few last questions to our panelists. We have a few minutes more. One of the attendee was asking, what is your favorite Georgia-based creepy story? So UFO sighting, vampire-related, ghost, doesn't matter, but what is your Georgia-based story that you prefer?
I recently learned about Lake Lanier up near Atlanta. It's a man-made lake, and it has been responsible for hundreds of deaths. And every time the water recedes, they find somebody else, or they find a car, or they find the top of a racetrack, like the stands of a racetrack. It's this really eerie, extraordinarily deep lake that people keep boating in and drinking in, and it gobbles people up. And I've never seen it. I've never been there. I just learned about it, and that is sort of the top of my list for things in Georgia that are really creeping me out. It's this man-made human goblin lake.
Mine was the house on Abercorn. I think it's 432 Abercorn in Savannah. That was supposed to be the most haunted house in Savannah. When I moved here, my family and I did a ghost tour, and that's where they end up. And the guy told us all these creepy stories and so terrifying. And the house was in disrepair. Well, there was just an article that the owner, the Gray, and his wife bought it, and they have done, you know, we could see it being redone, and now it's beautiful. And of course, now nobody says anything about it being a creepy house. So actually it was Dr. Pirok, we talked about that for a while, and your theory was houses that don't sell right away, it's because then people make up a ghost story. That's why it's not selling, because it's so haunted. Because do you know about all these murders that happened there?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good way to explain the house market.
Yeah, like it's so lovely. Why isn't it selling?
Right.
Ghosts.
And mine goes along with that. I haven't heard a lot of UFO stories about Georgia, but I've heard ghost stories. And as a homeowner in Georgia, I have a termite bond on my house. And termite guy came by a couple of years ago, and we just got chit chatting. And he asked me, what I did, and I told him his story, and asked me kinds of things. And I mentioned the UFOs, just sort of throw it out because sometimes that gets stories for me. And he started telling me that he was doing a termite inspection on an old abandoned home in Bullitt County in the middle of nowhere, and was under the floor under the piers. And suddenly somebody started walking above him, and he could smell cigarettes or the tobacco smoke, and through the slats of the floor could see feet. And then he immediately came out, jumped out. There were no cars, there were no people. That was a good story. I'd have him tell me it again, and maybe a third time. I enjoyed it. And he was very sincere. I don't think he was messing with me. Whatever he experienced, I really believe it was real to him.
Wow. So I want to thank all of our panelists. I think we're out of questions at this point. Just maybe a reminder of the class information and sort of the schedule that we can expect if we want to register for it. I really wish I was an undergrad, but maybe not. But that's another story. So Dr. Herringer, can you tell us about your class? And Dr. Pirok, we have a tentative schedule, maybe next fall. So go for it.
And we have to get Dr. Van Wagenen's class on the schedule too. Mine is History 2500, and it's Monday, Wednesdays at 2:30 in Statesboro.
My class will also be a History 2500, Haunted Histories. We're looking at fall 2022, so it'll be right in time for the Halloween creepy season. But so keep a lookout for that. It'll be 2 days a week, probably in the afternoon.
Perfect. And we're going to get Dr. Van Wagenen's class on the schedule for sure, because that's going to be something as well.
To be determined.
Yes.
To be determined. So thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to be your host tonight, and we're looking forward to seeing you in our classes. Have a good evening.